All right. I think this is a good number. We're at critical mass. I think it's a good time to get started. I'm Bartice Cox, and I work at Groundswell. I'm the Director of Marketing and Communications, and you are at the Afrofuture of Resilience webinar with Chandra Farley from Partnership of Southern Equity and Euneika Rogers-Sipp, who is our Distinguished Fellow here at Groundswell. I just wanted to open up and just have a brief moment of acknowledgement for the violent murder of Ahmaud Arbery. And for the thousands of people who have passed, over the last month and a half, 2 months, due to coronavirus and lack of healthcare and access to affordable healthcare. So just a moment for acknowledgement for that, and then we'll get started. Okay. Thank you so much for doing that with us. I'm going to hand it off now to Michelle Moore, our CEO here at Groundswell.
Thank you so much, Bartice, and thank you for leading us in a moment of acknowledgement. When we face evil, we have to cling to what is good. And good is redemptive, it is beautiful, and it is confronting. Good provokes an emotional, aesthetic response in us that compels us to action. And good can redeem even the most evil times. I am grateful to be introducing today's webinar because Afrofuturism is good. We are all blessed today to be led in this conversation about Afrofuturism and resiliency by two luminaries, Euneika Rogers-Sipp, founder of Destination Design School, creator of Digging Du Bois, and Groundswell Distinguished Fellow for Community Building, and Chandra Farley, the leader of Just Energy within Partnership for Southern Equity. In Groundswell's work building community, we are very proud to be working in joyful service to Partnership for Southern Equity's vision by developing a community-determined resilience hub together that will serve Spelman College and the broader Atlanta University Center complex and surrounding neighborhood. As we learned in the first of this webinar series, future is a verb. To quote my friend Ari Wallach, it's not set in stone, it's clay that we wrestle with. I hope we will all join together today in being inspired and informed and convicted to put what we are about to hear to work in how we future towards the redemption of our times. So it is my pleasure to pass the mic now to my colleague and an inspiration and someone who I learn from every single day, Euneika Rogers-Sipp. And as I do that, Bartice is going to shift me over into being an attendee of the webinar. So I look forward to listening and learning with everyone here today. Euneika.
Thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Michelle, for the introduction, and thank you, Bartice. I'm really excited about this presentation today. We were talking earlier about how joyful it is to be in a different conversation, right, around energy and energy futures. This is going to be a short presentation. It's not going to be very long because I'll be talking about some of what has shown up in my personal work through Afrofuturism. But the topic of Afrofuturism and resiliency particularly is very vast. It's vast. And so with the time that we have today, I want to cover very briefly Afrofuturism and its roots. But really what I'd like to outline is what is at stake for African-American communities working for change in the energy sector. And also a couple of projects that we are involved in at Groundswell. Next slide. So what is Afrofuturism? There are many definitions of Afrofuturism and iterations. The definition that I'm going to read is from Wikipedia, and it says that Afrofuturism is a cultural aesthetic. It's a philosophy of science, a philosophy of history that explores the developing intersection of African diaspora culture with technology. Next slide. The term itself is relatively new, but the philosophy is not. There are examples of it throughout history. It was coined first by cultural critic and philosopher Mark Derry in an essay that was published in the early 90s entitled Black to the Future. And in this essay, Derry was speculating on why so few African Americans were writing science fiction when they were, in a very real sense, the descendants of alien abductees. You can go to the next slide. This is a quote taken from Derry's essay, Black to the Future. In his own words, he says that African Americans inhabit a sci-fi nightmare in which unseen but no less impassable force fields of intolerance frustrate their movements. Official histories undo what has been done to them, and technology, be it branding, forced sterilization, the Tuskegee experiment, or tasers, is too often brought to bear on Black bodies. Next slide. And later in the essay, he asked the question, can a community whose past has been deliberately rubbed out and whose energies have subsequently been consumed by the search for legible traces of its histories, imagine possible futures? Next slide. And I say to that, the answer is yes, that we can. For me, ultimately, Afrofuturism is critical to our current movement because it creates a space for people, all people, not to be limited by what society has put upon them. If we are to truly address the root causes of our society and all of its shortcomings, we have to think beyond the structures and the approaches that have got us here. And so we have to bring this thinking forward in all of the work that we're doing, and particularly in the energy sector. You can go to the next slide. So am I an Afrofuturist? People ask me that a lot. But the answer for me, the answer to that question comes really from exercising agency. What do you do with the knowledge that you have? What do you do to situate yourself towards the change that you want to see in your community? You can take to the next photo. At the time that this photo was taken of me in my earlier days of the design work that I do, it was a culmination of years working on design projects with individuals who were socially and politically active through the arts, through music, and through film. And what had started as my very own instigation into skills and talents that I had gained through art school evolved into imagining the future of design and also ideas of shared ownership and stewardship. And so I began working with African-American families and cooperatives throughout the South to ensure that energy efficiency, irrigation, and solar technologies were accessible to them. This has then led to working nationally with civic leaders, with journalists, with architects, urban planners, policymakers, who come from around the world and share the same vision, one purpose: to make the world a better place for everyone. You can go to the next slide. So I want to make sure that we're all left with a few people who I believe are practitioners of Afrofuturist principles. The slide that you see now is a photo of Adrienne Marie Brown. She's a writer, a community organizer, and an activist, and founder of the Emergent Strategy Ideation Institute. It's a hub that uses science fiction to strengthen our imaginations and capacity to think beyond the limitations of our socialization. The image that you see next to it is a Black manifesto created by Black Space, an organization, a collective, that took principles from Adrienne's work to craft a vision of how to transform African-American neighborhoods. You can go to the next slide. And next we have a local leader, Lonnie Johnson. He's an inventor, he's an aerospace engineer and an entrepreneur. Many may know him as the inventor of the Super Soaker water gun. But what we should also point out is that he's using the proceeds from the sales of that toy gun to fund research into green battery technologies. And then to the right, you see Rhonda Jordan, Lane Jordan Atene, now that she's married. She's a graduate of MIT, who, while studying dance in Africa, co-founded EGG Energy. It's an energy service company that connects low-income customers in Tanzania to electricity. And currently, she's an energy specialist at the World Bank, focusing on smart grids and the integration of renewables in long-term capacity planning. She also acts as a core member of Sustainable Energy for All, its corporate team. You can go to the next slide. One of my favorite artists is Bodies. Isaac Kingele, his name is a challenge to produce sometime, but Isaac Kingele. Before I mention him, I want to talk about Akon, because Akon is standing next to a model of a city that he plans to build. Well, he has started building, has actually broken ground on it. It's called Akon City. It's in Senegal, where he is from, where he's descended. It focuses on cryptocurrency and renewable energy. Above it, we have Body's work, which, you know, he works out of materials that he finds in his everyday life, paper, commercial packaging, waste materials. And he creates these cities that he calls extreme maquettes that encompass civic buildings, public monuments, and private buildings. One of the things that I love about his work, and him recently in a statement that he made, that a model, the importance of models, that without a model, you're nowhere. That a nation that can't make models is a nation that doesn't understand things, and a nation that doesn't live. Can go on to the next slide. So that brings me, the idea of models, that brings me to Groundswell. What I love about the work that I'm doing with Groundswell, and the Groundswell as an organization, is that the model aspect of it, right? That whatever we are imagining for our future in energy, in this field, has to be demonstrated. This photo that you see on this slide is at the LaGrange Housing Authority. It celebrates the installation of a solar energy system, a smart flower. But one of the more recent projects that we're working on that I'm really excited about is a project that Michelle mentioned earlier, which is landing itself in the center of the city of Atlanta. And it is the first microgrid system that will be developed in the city. And I love about, I guess, what all of these projects that I wanted to demonstrate and what I wanted to lift up with Groundswell is that there are so many pieces to the work that people oftentimes don't understand, that there are values that are demonstrated and also that are represented in the way in which we choose our partners. We mentioned Project Southern Equity. And I'm really excited about Chandra coming on and talking about discussing Project Southern Equity and why they're such a valuable partner to have as we are implementing this project on the ground in Atlanta. But the most important thing is that these projects demonstrate what's possible. We're exploring all that is involved in taking an idea of what's possible in the future and turning that idea or dream into reality and sharing the proceeds of what makes it come to life. And so that's really all that I wanted to share at this moment. I'm looking forward to the questions that we'll get into, the question and answers after. And I thank you for your time.
Thank you, Euneika. And next we're going to have Chandra from Partnership of Southern Equity. Oh, hey, Chandra, I'm going to help you get your video started again. Here you go. Great. Would you mind making me a host again?
How about that?
Perfect.
Great. I knew that our yard blower would start right when it was time for me to get started, so I had to run out and ask him to stop. So thank you, Michelle and Bartiz and Euneika, for inviting me to join the conversation today. I feel like we're all long, fast friends already, and I'm really excited about being able to talk about a topic I think that probably I can honestly say I've never been able to touch on before in a work conversation. So looking forward to getting into this, and I appreciate Euneika's grounding on, you know, really the background and what Afrofuturism means. We had a couple of good conversations, and in our first ride to a Southeast Energy Conference together, we discovered that we both had backgrounds in the arts, and I feel like for sure that was really one of the reasons that I was really excited about this conversation. I think in a lot of the work that we do, we don't realize how much creativity and imagination is critical to being able to even realize and imagine what we're talking about in this work. So I will share my screen here. So it was funny when Euneika and I were talking about this, you know, I tried to go back to where I felt like I first heard of Afrofuturism, and I really couldn't point to it as a word, but I could definitely point to the experience and in music and in culture. So I had a good time being able to, you know, put a few images together as I talk, just because there's so many amazing parallels. And this imagining a better future and doing something about it was sort of, I was reading some different things and preparing for today is really something that resonated with me. So this is, you know, I thought the perfect, you know, image for me, sort of background in conversation. I'm from Tennessee originally. I moved to Atlanta in 1999, and full on in the ATLian experience, you know, Outkast, Goody Mob, you know, the music just really being almost literally like otherworldly. I can remember the first time that I heard Bombs Over Baghdad by Outkast, and it was like, I sort of sat up because I'd been the night before, and it was like, what is this? Like, I'd never heard anything like it before. And I really feel like that is fully encompassing of what's so important about Afrofuturism is that it's literally our escape. It is an ability to be able to imagine ourselves in a future that in reality is not always guaranteed to us, quite literally every day, and really evidenced by the way that Bartiz opened us up and the reflections that we needed to have today. So I do want to introduce Partnership for Southern Equity and our organization. We're a racial equity organization based here in Atlanta, working across Georgia and South. These are our focus areas. So we work at the intersection of racial equity and energy and climate, development, economic inclusion, and health. And the energy and climate justice work is the work that I lead through Just Energy. And our logo is a circle, and that really speaks to not only how we work as an organization, but how all of these issues are interconnected and cover the full sphere of all of our lived experience. And this is one of our guiding principles here from Nathaniel Smith, our founder and chief equity officer. It was actually the first quote of his that I wrote down way before I even started working at PSE. I'd heard him speak somewhere. And it is really how we live and how we teach what it really means to strive for and work towards a more racially equitable and racially just society. It's not just a thing, it's quite literally a way that we have to do things. And I think that is in direct alignment with the fantastical, imagination and visionary concepts and new ways and new technologies and innovations that we see a lot of and identify with in this sort of Afrofuturist frame. And so also the way that we do our work at PSE is really guided by these core actions and values here, and leading with race and the grounding in Black communities, brown communities, all of these marginalized groups that have been set aside to the margins, left out and left behind of conversations, and particularly around the energy and climate space. I'll never forget, like, one of the very first times I sort of readjusted, sort of had a readjustment in my thinking, and it was in a conversation around weatherization training. And this was, the advent of, the American Recovery Reinvestment Act that pumped, billions of dollars into energy efficiency and training and weatherization. And it was like one of those things, like sustainability and resilience that we are talking about, that in some ways has been repackaged and sold back to the very communities that had to innovate around these survival strategies. And now they are, and now it's like we've got to go back and educate people about something that they were the very innovators of. And, the technology aspect and the science aspect of Afrofuturism, I think is just in such direct alignment with that. It's like, even, to Euneika's point, when we were having the conversation about, who sort of coined the term Afrofuturism, it was a name given to something that was already in practice, was already lived experience. I think about The Wiz, like, I used to be able to stay up late. That's when I got to stay up late. If The Wizard of Oz came on, or if The Wiz came on TV, that was when I was allowed to stay up. So not knowing it, having a name for it then, but Essence Magazine actually did sort of a 7 things you should read or watch on Afrofuturism. And I was great to see The Wiz there. But again, it's another example of how we have always been leading. And when I talk about we, I'm talking about Black people, I'm talking about oppressed peoples, people who have been marginalized by race and class and income. And so the work that we do at PSE is really about being able to harness that power, the inherent power that is already in community and already in people, to lead and be the decision makers that we should be, to make sure that solutions that are being proposed, technologies that are being proposed, that we are the decision makers about whether or not that is the right solution for our community. So we talk about the equity ecosystem at PSE a lot. That is the basis of our theory of change as an organization. We need all different kinds of people and actors, from the professional advocates, the scientists, the technical assistance organizations, the advocates, our grassroots neighborhood-based organizations, all of those folks working together and building power to make sure that we are leading in the decision-making. So through all of these ways in which we do our work at Partnership for Southern Equity across all of our issue areas, community engagement. And I should stick an A in front of that because we really like to talk about authentic community engagement. So not only do we have information to bring to community, but we understand that community has just as much to teach us about the best way to work together. We have organizers that work on the ground across the state, living in the communities that they, work in and represent. Leadership development, so working with communities through various programs. Our Just Energy Academy is in a second year. We have a couple of other academies with our other issue areas, but building leadership development around racial equity and around Energy Policy 101, talking about the Public Service Commission, all of these things that we don't necessarily get to in our daily life, but folks who are making decisions that directly impact our pocketbooks and sound like my great-grandmother when I say pocketbooks, so directly impact our wallets, our communities, and research and reporting, the science and technology aspect that's inherent to an Afrofuturist frame is very present in communities and in the work that we do. So, I think, Afrofuturism definitely got a big bump when Black Panther came out. And there's this really great article from Barbara Hilton, and I think the subject line is so clear that these are the spaces that we are able to imagine and create in an Afrofuturist frame are really where we can safely claim our space and be who we are. And this photo here is of me and my friends. I'm down there in the corner with my hand on my hip. This is the Inman Park Festival parade that happens annually in Atlanta, and they do. One of my best friends, Bro, had this idea that we had to do a Black Panther float. Inman Park is a majority white neighborhood, lots of diversity in some of the artists that live there, and just connections from friendships and communities that surround it. So we had a costume artist come out, and a couple of different ones make these costumes for us. You can't see the panther. We're all covered up back there. And we had this float, and we had a DJ riding with us. And it was really about claiming this space. And it was a glorious day, and I thought it was the perfect frame for what we're talking about here. And, again, the Just Energy Academy, I wanted to show this photo, but, it's really about communities being able to speak for themselves and harnessing that power and owning that power. So I'm looking forward to questions and conversations. And here's some more amazing art that I found, but I'm looking forward to the rest of the conversation.
Awesome. Thank you so much to the both of you. I'll kick off actually with a couple questions of my own. Let me see if I can get my video back on, if that's possible. And it is. Hi, everyone. Yeah, so, this is something that, I think about a lot. Obviously, I'm an artist. I make music. I record bands. I put out records. That's like what I do for my, with a lot of my time. And one thing that I think about a lot is the role of art in activism, and how there have been so many past examples of art leading activism, right? And I look at the time period we're in now, and I always think, as a musician, as a writer, as a poet, how can I add my art to the organizing work that's going on? And you two both kind of live in the epicenter, at what I would call the epicenter. I'm living in Georgia, and I wonder, how have you both used art to power your organizing work and to get stuff done? I'm sure you both have different answers for that, but I just love to kind of hear you react to it.
Go ahead, Euneika.
Okay. Yeah, so that photo that I showed of myself in the green ivy jacket was in 1999. And so it was a time, at that time I was working strictly in sustainable fashion. And I mentioned I was working with artists in Atlanta, my studio here in Atlanta. It was shot in front of my studio in Atlanta, in the West End. You know, I was really focused on finding artists that I felt had messages that were, supported my values. So it, you know, in order to work, sometimes I had to work with artists that did not, which is ultimately the reason why I actually got out of that field. But I was fortunate in Atlanta to work with, but the first music group that I worked with was Arrested Development. I styled their cover and made many of their clothes on the road. And if you know Arrested Development's work, you know, early 90s hip hop band, you know that their music was for life and for living and was positive, and it was about liberation of Black people. So that I was very fortunate to be able to land my first job as a designer, as a costumer, as a stylist with a group like that. And that laid the foundation of how I saw the work that I wanted to do. And that led to working with the Goody Mob that Chandra mentioned, and Outkast, and working with those groups. You know, what does it mean to be a Goody Mob? A mob of folks that want to do good. Yay. I'll sign me up, right? And so, you know, it wasn't as easy to convince the artists that I was working with at that time that they should be wearing sustainable clothing. I mean, with Arrested Development, it was part of their aesthetic. But with Goody Mob, we resulted in fake fur pants a lot, you know, like instead of real fur. I mean, at least I did get that. It ended up being, you know, patchwork pants that would reflect the cultural heritage of quilting, you know, as a design concept. That also was a way to educate people about recycling and reuse. But that was some of the exciting work, but also the challenging work. And that's how I saw that I was able to have influence. I basically meet people in the arts, in the creative field. You meet people where they are. And we all educate. Chandra mentioned that, you know, it's all about educating and being educated. So it's an opportunity to share what you know, and also the opportunity to be educated about what you know. And the beautiful thing is when you take your individual of the creative process, I believe, you know, when you're able to take your individual desire, intention, or skills, and to marry that with someone else's or another group's, and then the individual pursuit to happiness, creative happiness, as I say, ends up being a collective pursuit. It's a shared vision. And so that's really how I've always been able to manage to bring the things I care about the environment, the things I value in community building and sharing into the arts. If it's music and it's, you know, something that is not as, I would say in terms of, you know, it's not as, and much of a service in terms of people wearing it on their bodies. So it's a much more intimate experience per se. Because as a writer of music, it's a different sort of set of categories that you're engaging. But the proceeds of those sales will go somewhere, right? I mean, all of the things that we create and make will generate some form of, you know, it should generate something that can then fuel something else. And that's the advice that I would have. I mean, that's not really advice, but that's what I would share about that process for me as a creator.
Thanks. And Chandra, do you want to take a shot at it too?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we Black people, oppressed people, are, you know, inherently creative, right? I mean, because making a way out of no way, and, you know, the innovations that come out of that. And, you know, art and culture is the great bridge. And, you know, particularly with our, you know, our community organizing work, you know, sometimes it's funny. One of our organizers, you know, Juan Smith, you know, we may have put out, you know, like one of our education series, you know, when I started at PSD, it was like, oh, you know, we're going to do this Energy Equity 101, you know, and she's like, you know, that's kind of lame, you know, we're going to, you know, reach people, you know, we need to, so she came up with more money, more power, you know, and so because when we talk about energy efficiency, clean energy, the clean energy economy, and you know, the opportunities to transform and reverse some of these systemic inequities. You know, power is, you know, electric power, but power of the people to be self-determined and make decisions for themselves. And I think that's a good example of why it is so important that creativity is a skill. You know, you hear people talking about design thinking a lot now. You know, understanding that along with the science and technology, there's got to be that bridge to the people that we hope to affect and move change with. And, you know, art and culture is, you know, is a critical way to do that. So there's, you know, so many wonderful organizations that do great work around, you know, bridging that gap. And, you know, we're definitely always looking for ways to embed more creativity in our work, not just from a visual perspective, but even just, you know, the way that we shape our engagement in community.
Mm-hmm. That's awesome. And you know, we're starting to get a few more questions, so I'll keep it moving. This question, you know, I've noticed that among the questions, there's a theme that has arisen. And so I'm going to try to contextualize these and bring them all together. But we have a question on how can we build an equitable energy future when corporations like global manufacturing systems behind solar, wind, and storage at times maintain a stranglehold on power. And then kind of like as a back into that question, which I think is kind of related, how can white people support Afrofuturism other than get out of the way? You know, that's what the question says. So I'm curious how you to react to those.
You know, so Chandra, you might want to take a, do you want to take a stab at the first one, equitable energy future, corporations, since you...
Sure, yeah, so, you know, we have to get money out of politics, right? And I know a lot of people are disillusioned by voting, but it is the one lever that we have. And it's a little extreme, but I still, you know, I think it was the second Bush election, and Sean Combs, Diddy, or whatever we're calling him now, you know, sort of came out with this vote or die campaign. And we, you know, we have to get money out of politics. You know, it drives everything. And until we do that, we have to keep raising our voice and demanding a different way. So, and I think you know, one of the frames that I think is a great tie between Afrofuturism and the energy and climate space, you know, is this philosophy around energy democracy. You know, that first of all, energy is not a commodity. You know, nobody owns the sun and the wind, right? And how do we shift our thinking so that we are, you know, as Denise Fairchild wrote, you know, in the book Energy Democracy, along with Al Weinraub, energy is commons. And energy is commons as a means to transform the inequities around, you know, the social inequities, the racial inequities that feed into everything. So, you know, we've got to push forward and stop accepting things the way they are, and really pull all the levers available to us, whether we're in a particular industry or not, to really start transforming these systems.
I agree. I think that's a great answer for that one. And I, you know, to the question of how can white people support Afrofuturism? You know, I pointed out Mark Derry, and Derry was indeed discovering the contributions and taking note of what he was observing from a particular genre in science. But Derry has been, continued to be in the conversation and in support of the Afrofuturist, what he coined the Afrofuturist genre and movement. And I say that to say, because he had a perspective, and he was capturing what he thought of as a moment in that genre, and he took a lot of hits with sharing his perspective. But what he did as a white man was take a risk with putting out what he thought he saw, sharing what he thought he saw, and documenting the history, the legacy of Samuel Delany, Octavia Butler, other musicians, Sun Ra, various artists. And so I think his writing is going to continuously be up for critique. But the good thing about it, one of the lessons we can learn from him is that he wrote about it. He gave name to it, and he opened himself up for an opportunity, room, to grow around how to construct a narrative around this thing called Afrofuturism. Now, with that, he had to get out of the way. I mean, it wasn't even really a choice of, I think the frame is how can we, help Afrofuturism, support Afrofuturism other than get out of the way. And I think learning from this particular person, right? This person, this scholar, the value of acknowledging what you see, and trying to your best ability to bring truth to what you see. But that's not something that you do in isolation. You have to be in relationship, authentic relationship with people, the very people that are that you're building with. And so in terms of Afrofuturism, we can continue to, I think white people can continue to learn about it, to continue to learn from African people, descendants of African people, and to share what they learn. Be open for mistake, critique, take risk to be different. And more importantly, at this moment, really, really, really work hard to center African-American people and communities the way in which they see themselves centered in the work that they do, supporting that work, supporting women leaders, supporting our leaders in the communities that are designing these futures.
Yeah. And I think the thing that sticks out to me in just kind of what you said and in the question is, this author, his work remains open to being criticized, right? I mean, we can still look at that and we can still draw our conclusions from that. And I feel like in my role at Groundswell and in previous jobs I've had hundreds of white colleagues who have come up to me after a meeting and said, oh, I wanted to say this thing, but I didn't want to ruffle any feathers. I know this is an EJ meeting. I don't want to say anything that may come off as, oppressive or da-da-da. And my thing has always been, say it, get it out. Like, let's talk about it, and that's the only way we're going to move anything forward. I know Chandra, Euneika, and I have been in meetings like that, together, and so it's something that, that is a necessary part of anything moving forward ever. So, yeah, I would just like to put a period on that. And on the, and just to move forward, just to be mindful of everyone's time, we've got about 12 more minutes. And so and we've got a few more questions. So I'm going to keep it moving. But Michelle has asked, culture eat strategy for lunch. This is like a saying that is, we're familiar with. How can people on this webinar and how can the people who will watch this video bring a celebration of Afrofuturism into their work in an authentic way, right? I think that's something few people probably are asking themselves after seeing this. And basically, how can we bring this Afrofuturistic vision into the center of how we're defining futures and what we're advocating for? Love to kind of hear you react to that, Chandra, actually, like through your work at PSC.
Yeah, I think that, it's culture, right? It's just, it's culture, it's art, it's creativity, it's science, it's technology. It's, it's like the advent of STEM, right? And then it was like, oh, let's not forget the A, now it's STEAM, which is, because again, it's an important bridge, and that can show up in many different ways. It can, listening sessions, community conversations versus a forum or a presentation, immediately starting with a two-way. We want this to be a conversation where it's shared learning, not just putting information out. I think just small things like that are ways that we maybe don't label it, or probably, wouldn't label it Afrofuturism, but just opening the door for, I think arts and culture and creativity and the natural marrying of innovation and technology, particularly when you're talking about renewable energies, will be there. And music, all of those things that we don't think are necessarily subject matter relevant are indeed the very basis of the subjects that we are talking about.
Thank you. And I've got another question from Avni. This one's for Euneika, which I think you'll line up well with your background. But they ask, I feel like a lot of white writers or writers of privilege fantasize a future of a dystopian climate apocalypse depicted by the remaining white able-bodied survivors fighting amongst each other in order to survive. But as we know, in any kind of climate disaster, people of color and marginalized communities are going to be impacted first and foremost. Do you find that Afrofuturism addresses this type of fetishization of violence and disaster and individualism with a hopeful vision for the collective future? And if so, are there any artists or writers that you think do this particularly well, other than those that you've already noted? Just curious.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I mean, with the presentation being as short as it was, I have to say that there is so much literature and that out there, and that there are so many different, there are many iterations of how Afrofuturism has evolved to answer just some of those same questions, right? I didn't mention Greg Tate, who was also responding to the Black to the Future essay that was written, and responding to say that, like, listen, hey, you're critiquing us about not writing sci-fi in the manner in which you perceive it, but we are living the sci-fi stories. I mean, we are living in a time where, our lives are really pretty much science fiction. I mean, we can look at a historical context of how African Americans have been considered 3/5 of a human. That's sci-fi. That's not real, And so these belief systems have been part of our reality. Apocalyptic, slavery. Slavery was our apocalypse, So the lived experience, it's a situation where how we survived the terror of our history here is one that should continue to inform anyone who has a question like that. And that's where your answer is. how we as African Americans have survived, our resiliency, in the fact that we are still here and we are still imagining a better day, a brighter future as a result of all of what we've experienced, is where your answer lies. And so much of what Afrofuturism, also the frame, and so, scholars who are leading in Afrofuturism thought address is, this evolution today and how it shows up in all kinds of genres, right? In terms of the organizing space, in community development space, there is plenty of room for us to really look at things like economies. I mean, that's why I showed, alternative economies, and I showed ACON, right? The idea of a cryptocurrency and blockchain technology, and these questions about what is it that we will build for ourselves, operating out of distress,
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, we've got 5 more minutes, so I'm going to get one more question in. If we have time, I'll squeeze one more in. But we have a question from Dominic Thomas, who's in New York. He says, thank you for this amazing presentation. He's a climate organizer in New York City and wonders how you bring other groups of people into the work with an understanding that the liberation of Black folks liberates all oppressed groups. That's a jump ball for both of you. I'm curious.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Chandra, I'll just start briefly and let you kind of hold it. The way we bring other people to work, I mean, sit in all kinds of spaces, different types of spaces. And one of the things that we often talk about as Black leaders, that are, especially with nonprofit organizations, is that we sit in so many spaces that are not really aren't part of our job description. Like, it's not part of our organizational mission, but we get called to sit in spaces, to hold space, to help diversify the room, help understand, how to create policies and how to create strategies and approaches for understanding Blackness. So yeah, there's a lot of sitting in spaces over the years, and bringing in all kinds of people. I mean, literally, if we were to do a snapshot over the past 20 years of the rooms that Black leaders who are working for social justice sit in, and how we hold spaces in those rooms, you would see. And sometimes, oftentimes when the real work is being done, it's not easy. It's difficult work. I mean, there are tears that are shed, because we're at the core. What we're talking about addressing a painful past, a painful history, and that for the most part is still hidden by the American public, and not really deeply understood or felt, or valued. And so that has to be addressed, and that is what we are doing currently. We will continually do, I believe, as we address that. And so, how do you bring in others? You again meet people where they are, and ask them if they'll go on the journey to discover truth, and to lift truth up, and to empower all people.
Chandra?
Yeah, I think Euneika, really covered it. Everybody's not ready for that journey, right? So I think that I think things are shifting a little bit, but I think all the time and energy and emotional capital and emotional labor that sometimes we expend on people who are just not, people and certain groups that are just not ready. And you create open space, create safe space for conversation, And when the time is right, for certain groups, they may come along, they may not. But when you were reading the question, Bartiz, and it made me think about Lilla Watson. She's an indigenous Australian activist and artist, and so she's credited with the the quote, and it's, "If you've come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you've come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together." And I think we're all really familiar with that quote. And even Lilla herself, if I'm getting her name right, says she doesn't like to be credited that with her own. She likes to make sure that, people know it was born out of collective process with Aboriginal activists and artists and, and this culture. So I think that's the sort of, a really good frame for us to remember and think about as we're doing this work.
That's great.
Right.
Thank you, Chandra.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you so much. And we're at 1 o'clock right now, so to be mindful of everyone's time, I'm gonna bring this to a close. I know there are a few outstanding questions, but what I can do to get those answered is I can forward those to Chandra and Euneika, and if they have time, we can get those answered and follow up with you in a timely manner. But thanks again to everyone that showed up, and thank you so much, Euneika and Chandra, for taking the time to do this. I think this was a wonderful conversation, one that needed to be had. And everybody, stay blessed. Have a good week. Enjoy your weekends.
You too, Bartiz.
Yeah, keep your heads up. I know there's a lot going on.
Thank you, Groundswell, for convening this conversation.
Yes.
It was just definitely fun. We're gonna have another one of these.
Yes.
Yeah,
I agree.
yeah.
Thank you, Michelle, for visioning this. This is great.
Yeah.
All right, y'all. Okay, I'm bringing it to a close. Y'all have a good day. Thank you so much.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye.